All right, everybody, here we are again, and today we're going to start on lecture 42, World War I. I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as I can, but I don't know, this is kind of a big one. This is a pretty important subject. So, but either way, we're gonna get our way through it. And the best part of having these videos on YouTube is the pause button. So you guys are going to be fine. But let's move ourselves on here. Today what we're going to do is we're going to analyze the causes and consequences of U.S. entry into World War I. And, oh, that's not good. Hold on. All right, when the boss calls, you got to answer the phone. Anyway, so this is what we're going to do. Moving along. Now, we're going to begin this story with Woodrow Wilson. Of course, from the European perspective, the World War I has already started. I'm not really going to get into the particulars about that, but in essence, a regional conflict in the Balkans resulted in the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, who was the main man of Austria. Austria got really upset, and all the other countries ended up getting upset, and they all had their own alliances, and consequently Austria threatened Serbia, which pulled in Russia, responded by saying, oh yeah, if you mess with Serbia, we're going to mess with you, and then Germany says, well, if you mess with Austria, we're going to mess with you, and then, of course, that involved France, and then it all kind of blew up from there. So World War I is going to happen in Europe, and has already been going on since 1914. And one of the things that the United States has been very particular about is remaining out of European wars. There have been plenty of European wars during American history that the United States largely stayed out of. Yeah, not the Napoleonic Wars, but we've, for the most part, stayed out of all of the European wars. And we're going to try to continue this this process. So Woodrow Wilson in 1916, the World War I's been going on for 2 years, and one of the things that Woodrow Wilson is going to run on, of course, he's running against Charles Evans Hughes, a very popular politician, but Wilson's he's built his coalitions pretty well. He has a pretty solid progressive agenda, but he's got a progressive agenda that hasn't ticked off the conservatives all that much. So he's probably going to win, but one of the aces in his deck has been the fact that he kept us out of war. So as we kind of see here, we can get an image here. This is a wagon that went around, campaigning for Woodrow Wilson, and we can see one of the signs here: "Vote for Wilson, peace with honor." And that was kind of one of the ideas that Wilson was promoting, this idea of peace with honor. Of course, his slogan was, he kept us out of war. There were buttons, vote for Wilson, he kept us out of war. And he tried to keep us out of war because getting involved in these European problems was incredibly unpopular. And we were getting reports from the Western Front of just how horrible the combat was. I mean, World War I was destroying an entire generation of young men in Europe, and the United States did not want to get involved in that kind of a slaughterhouse. It was a very, very unpopular war, very unpopular decision. So Wilson wanted to keep us out of this war. And as we know about Wilson from last lecture as well, he wasn't particularly interested in foreign issues. He didn't want to have to deal with foreign issues in his presidency, but he did. But ultimately, Woodrow Wilson is going to make a request for war. And we're going to discuss just why in just a moment, but he will win the election of 1916. He will take the oath of office in March of 1917, and awkwardly, he's going to ask for a declaration of war within a couple of weeks of his inauguration, which means that his whole campaign at that point is going to be suspect. But Wilson does have some reasons for wanting to take the United States into war. So let's take a look at some of these reasons. I think the next slide is reasons for U.S. involvement. For the most part, U.S. policy from 1914 right up until 1917 was one of neutrality. That the United States was simply not going to get involved on either side of this war, either to support Britain or to support Germany. And of course, there were an awful lot of German immigrants who had come to the United States. They were very successful. There was an awful lot of them. There were also a lot of Irish immigrants who were rather sympathetic toward the German cause because they were anti-Britain. So there was a population in the United States that said, hey, maybe we should side with Germany instead of Britain. But either way, Wilson doesn't want to get involved in this, so we're going to actually declare neutrality. but let's face it, it was neutrality-ish. The vast majority of of our investments, of loans, was going to the Allies. They were going to the British and going to the French to help fight this war, and going to Russia to fight Germany. We were shipping arms, and we were shipping weapons and munitions and material to the British and to the French and to the Russians. And of course, during the battle, you're a German soldier and you look down and you see an American-made rifle on the battlefield, and it's not your rifle. It's got to come from somewhere. So the Germans were getting very upset with the fact that, yes, you're declaring neutrality, but in fact, you are not neutral. You are, in fact, supporting our enemies. And the Germans realized that it was, in many cases, American-made weapons that was killing German soldiers on the Western Front. So the United States had made millions of dollars worth of investments in Britain as well, and by 1917 it was rather shaky as to whether or not there was going to be a return on that particular investment. For American bankers, Britain was looking like it was losing the war. Also too, culturally, the United States was culturally more tied to Britain. I mean, the United States was a former British colony. We speak English. We had an English-based culture for a very long time. And we also had strong ties with England and with the United Kingdom. So culturally speaking, we had a greater... despite German and Irish immigration, we had cultural ties to Britain, and Britain, of course, was having some issues. Now, it didn't hurt either that Britain also had a very active propaganda campaign going on in the United States to convince Americans about how horrible and how brutal the Germans were. Wars are brutal and horrible, so this is the stuff that kind of happens. But the most immediate reasons why the United States is going to get involved in World War I has to do with German use of a brand new technology called the submarine. The submarine is a ship, travels underwater, as you all know, and when it sees a ship, it finds a ship, it can come up real quick, boom, fire a torpedo, and blow the ship up, and there's very little defense at that time against submarines. So the Germans were using these ships, submarines, not just to take out British warships, but they also were starting to target civilian ships. And oftentimes the reason for attacking these civilian ships is because it was the civilian ships that were carrying weapons and material to the Allies. So the Germans started to sink ships, regardless of whether Americans were on it. Of course, the most notorious episode was the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Now, don't get this mixed up. The sinking of the Lusitania did not bring the United States into World War I. It had happened 2 years before. But it certainly is going to be the first really hard hit against the United States. Now, the Lusitania was a British cruise liner. It was a civilian vessel. But it was suspected by the Germans of having weapons on it. It turns out that the Lusitania did, in fact, have weapons on that ship. And the Germans actually put up a notice. This is a primary source from this time, in which the Germans are telling Americans to... This was right there on the cruise lines when you walk into the ship. Hey, don't get on this ship. We're at a state of war with Britain. If we find this ship, we're going to sink it. And of course, the Americans just went, well, we can't let a simple little war interfere with our cruise plans. So they got on the ship, and ultimately the Germans did sink the Lusitania, and 120 some odd Americans were killed. This is a real problem. Now, Wilson and his diplomats went to Germany and said, hey, you can't do this. If you continue to do this, if you continue to sink American ships, we're going to enter the war. And Germany backed down and said, all right, we won't kill any more, shoot and target any more ships that have Americans on it, but you've got to stop sending money and material to our enemies. Later on, the Germans are going to sink the liner Sussex, also killing more Americans. And eventually the Germans will take what's called the Sussex Pledge. They're going to promise, cross our heart, hope this time, hope to die, we're not going to sink any more ships. But ultimately, the Germans are going to come back and they're going to take back the Sussex Pledge, and they will announce that they're going to continue and they're going to resume sinking pretty much any ship that they suspect is carrying weapons and helping their enemies. Also, too, in February, March, depending on whose calendar, the Russians at that time used the old Julian calendar. So there's a discrepancy between the dates. But depending on which calendar you use, February or March, most historians use February, I think. The February Revolution. What ended up happening was Russia was just getting tagged in this war, draining resources. People were starving in the streets, and they just had enough, and they rebelled against their government, overthrew the government, and established a kind of a revolutionary socialist government under the guy by the name of Kerensky. And this was the February Revolution, and this was really dangerous stuff because now the Russians could end up pulling out of the war. One of the reasons why they rebelled against their government was to get out of this war. Now, Kerensky wasn't going to pull out of the war. He still wanted to maintain his alliances with other countries and knew that if he pulled out of the war, he would lose those alliances, and he needed those alliances to help him build his country. But the Allies didn't really know that. They knew that he was under a great deal of pressure to pull out of the war. But probably the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back was something called the Zimmermann letter. The Zimmermann letter was a telegram from a German diplomat to the German embassy in Mexico, and the idea behind this telegram was to communicate to the Mexicans that if the United States enters the war, Mexico should invade the United States. And if Mexico invaded the United States and kept the United States busy on this side of the Atlantic, then when Germany wins the war, which it looked like they were probably going to win with Russia falling apart, once Germany wins the war, they will come over, help the Mexicans defeat the United States, and return to the Mexico the lands that they had lost in the Mexican-American War. Well, this is absolutely going to outrage the American public, and ultimately Woodrow Wilson will appear before Congress and ask for a formal declaration of war against the Empire of Germany, which he is going to get. So the United States is going to end up into this war. And now Wilson was known for being a moralist. He was known for being an idealist. So he's going to attach ideal values to fighting this war. He does not want this war, at least expressly, he does not want this war to simply be just another war for territorial, for imperialistic gain. He wants to create a war to end all wars. This war has become so horrible that the very notion of continuing on with fighting other countries in the face of machine guns and bombs and tanks and things along those lines is just outrageous. So what we're going to do is we're going to end this war, and then we're going to create a world, create a society afterwards in which war does not happen anymore. We're going to create a peaceful world. So part of his goals was to create a war, to fight this war to end all wars. Didn't quite do that. And number two, he said that this was a war to make the world safe for democracy. The idea behind this is one of the reasons why we're ending up into this war is because of these militaristic regimes that are making these decisions for their people. Instead, if you have a democratic society, small d democratic society, the people are not going to vote for a war, these kinds of horrible wars. So if you make the world safe for democracy, then you reduce the likelihood of these wars happening. There's some data to support that that's true. However, of course, World War I does not make the world safe for democracy, as we're going to learn very shortly. Either way, the United States is going to prepare for war. Now, despite the fact that Wilson gets this declaration of war, and people were legitimately outraged over the Zimmermann letter, this was not a particularly popular war. So Woodrow Wilson is actually going to have to figure out a way to get soldiers to sign up to go to this war. So he's going to implement the Selective Service Act, which is a conscription act, basically. It's going to put young men's names into a lottery and draw those names out, and if your name gets called, you got to go to war. You got to go to fight, even whether you want to fight or not. You got to go. So the Selective Service Act, and using the Selective Service Act, he is going to raise a large number of American soldiers to go and fight in this war. There is going to be an out. You can be what is called a conscientious objector if you have religious reasons for not wanting to participate in the war. But aside from that, or if you simply were physically incapable of fighting, then you would be considered ineligible for the draft. But other than that, you're going to have to fight, and this is going to open the draft originally ages 18 to 30. Eventually, those ages will be extended to 18 to 45. He'll put together a war industries board. The idea is that the entire economy of the country is going to have to be dedicated to fighting this war. So the war industries board is going to, is a government-controlled organization that is going to go in and organize which industries are going to produce which munitions and which material for the war effort, and coordinate those efforts. Of course, the folks who own these industries are still going to get paid. They're going to make a tremendous amount of profits. In fact, later on, somebody's going to investigate just how much profiteering there was in this war, and they're going to be appalled by the level of profits that were being made by many of these industries producing material for the soldiers. We're also going to have something called the Committee for Public Information, the Creel, otherwise known as the Creel Commission, led by this fellow here, a gentleman by the name of George Creel. And the goal of this commission is basically a propaganda campaign. On one hand, we're going to spread information around the country, all over the country, in every way we possibly can. I think they hired something like 1,000 people to go around and make at least 750 speeches a year, promoting this war and promoting the war effort. And then on the other hand, also, we want to make sure that people who are against the war don't get a chance to speak out, and they don't get a chance to argue their case. This is known as the Creel Commission. And it was, in essence, America's first true propaganda commission, in essence. We also have the National War Labor Board. The goal of that is to kind of, we can't have people going on strike during this war. We're going to have to figure out how to organize our labor. And at the same time, we're going to have millions of people who are going to be going overseas to fight in this war, which means it's going to create a labor shortage, which means then that means there's less of an incentive for industries to participate if they have to pay their laborers too much. So the National War Labor Board is going to be involved in organizing labor and making sure that labor is taken care of and that there's a balance here. And also a food administration. A lot of food and edibles is not going to be able to be eaten. And we got to take a lot of this stuff. Oils, sugars, and things along those lines are needed on the front. Fats are needed on the front to help fight this war. They're not only used for food, but they're also used for mechanical devices and for artillery and weapons and for coolants and things along those lines. So we have this gentleman here, Herbert Hoover, comes into the public eye. He's an engineer. He's going to come in. He's going to take over the food administration, and he's going to do a very able job of coordinating America's food efforts, and of course, encouraging the growth of victory gardens. Instead of people going to the grocery store to pick their vegetables and things along those lines, they simply plant their vegetables and they pick them in their own backyard, which is a really efficient way of doing things. He's going to do a very admirable job in organizing this and making it so that it is a largely voluntary effort. It wasn't. He didn't put any mandates on people. He simply helped, the war effort by saying, "Hey, if you do this, and we're going to make it easier for you to plant these victory gardens, it's going to help the war effort. And you can feel good about yourself. Yay, you!" And people pretty much did it. They participated. We are going to see some tremendous amount of wartime propaganda going along these lines. All of the information that was coming out of the government at this point is going to point at the reasons why we have to go and fight this horrible, horrible war, and why we have to put our sons and our husbands and our fathers, in some cases, in harm's way in order to fight these Germans. And what propaganda is propaganda is basically an information assault. It's in essence, you are only allowing the information that you want people to hear to be heard, and you're not allowing information that contradicts you to be heard. So this is propaganda. So it's information that supports your cause, and it is all-encompassing. It's everywhere you go. So everywhere people went, they saw posters like this. This is a really, really great example of the use of propaganda. So, and what you see here is this is a big ape-looking monster who is clearly wearing a German war helmet. And he is holding a club with a German term for culture on it. And if you take a look here, you realize that he is standing on America. It's hard to see on the video, but here it says America, and in the backgrounds, of course, you can see the ruins of Europe in the background. And of course, this beast is in the process of ravaging a clearly Aryan, Anglo-Saxon-looking woman. So this is a real great example of propaganda for a couple of reasons. What are some characteristics that we see here? Well, for one thing, the propaganda is going to convince people that a loss, a defeat in this war effort means the end of everything that you hold dear. And of course, we can see that in this particular poster with the absolute destruction that's happening in the background. And now, he's carrying this bloody club into America to do his damage. So a loss is an ultimate defeat. Everything that you know and love is going to end as if we lose this war. Also, the enemy is clearly evil. In fact, not only is the enemy clearly evil, he is a subhuman. He is less than a human being. So we should not have any problems at all killing this brute, any more than we would kill any other kind of a monster or beast who is coming to attack, of course, our women and our daughters. So this is a second characteristic of propaganda. The enemy is ultimately evil. There's nothing good about him. There's no redeemable qualities about the enemy. And also, this enemy clearly wants to destroy you. He is clearly, out for revenge. He doesn't have any other ulterior motives. He just wants to destroy. And also, to not fight him, of course, again, looking at the vulnerable woman, to not fight this beast is an act of cowardice. It is not a moral position. It is not something that you're going to do. You're going to go and fight in whatever way you possibly can. So this is the nature of propaganda. In World War I, it continues to be the nature of propaganda today. Moving along, now this war isn't just going to take place on the battlefields, it's also going to take place on what we call the home front. And the home front, in essence what we're talking about here is something that is called a total war. In other words, all efforts of the nation are engaged in fighting this war, and consequently, from the point of view of the enemy, all elements of the society are potential targets for this war. So it's understood that once we go to Germany, we're going to go after everything. All elements of German society are engaged in fighting this war. Therefore, they're all targets. Roads, bridges, sewer systems, industries, civilians, military, whatever, everything, farms, everything is involved in the fighting of this war. Therefore, everything is a target. Well, the same held true in the United States, although there was very little threat that the United States itself was actually going to be targeted. Regardless, all aspects of American life was dedicated to winning World War I. We just talked about all of the different government agencies that were put into place to organize and coordinate the war effort. So industry, family, media, all of these things were put into fighting and winning this particular war. Women especially are going to play a central role in winning this war. Especially now, let's be careful. Many history textbooks kind of give you the indication that women stayed home and raised the children, and men went to the factories. And then during World War I, men went off to fight, women went into the factories. Well, we know from our earlier lectures that this is simply not true. That in fact, women were oftentimes in the factories and were a major component of factory labor and industrial labor. However, middle-class women weren't. But during the war effort, we actually see a huge influx of middle-class women going into the industries and going into the factories to work. And this is going to be a huge shift, a huge cultural shift for the United States as these women get more and more life experience outside of the home, outside of the domestic arena, and also it is going to be a prod and a boost to push and promote the 19th Amendment, which is going to allow women the right to vote. But we also have to say, we talked about propaganda just a minute ago, well, the other side of propaganda is the stifling of dissent. On the one hand, you want to tell a story about fighting this war. On the other hand, you don't want anybody else to come up and say, hey, we shouldn't be fighting this war, that this war is an immoral act. So Congress is going to pass the Espionage Act, which is going to make it, of course, illegal for Americans or anybody else to in any way impede the war effort, and the Sedition Act, which means that it's going to become illegal to speak out against the government. Now think about this. These are we have what we think are First Amendment rights. But at the same time, here's the Sedition Act, and this isn't the first time in American history. We saw this with John Adams, that we're actually going to have a Sedition Act that's going to limit the ability to speak. And this is going to be tested in the Supreme Court. A guy by the name of Charles Schenck, pictured down here, is going to go out in front of an army recruitment station, and he's going to start passing out literature talking about the evils of this particular war and why we should not fight, and you as a young man should not sign up for going to Europe and fighting this imperialistic war. Schenck was arrested, he stood trial, and eventually that trial is going to make its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court will uphold Schenck's conviction. And the rationale behind this is actually delivered by the great jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes, in which Oliver Wendell Holmes stated that Charles Schenck, in opposing and speaking out against the war, was creating a clear and present danger to the United States. And he created the analogy that, and this is a very famous analogy, of free speech rights does not protect a person from yelling fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. So by doing so, you're creating a clear and present danger, and therefore the government has the right to intervene. Of course, we can question that. Of course, Charles Schenck was basically saying if you go to war, you could be killed, or you can be forced to kill for a cause that isn't worthwhile. Well, maybe it's worthwhile, maybe it isn't, but the fact is, you going off to war is basically walking into a burning building that really is on fire. Well, that's the other side of the argument. Regardless, the Schenck conviction was upheld, as was the conviction of Eugene V. Debs. Now, we've talked about Eugene Debs before. He was the organizer of the Pullman strike. He was a socialist candidate for president of the United States. This was a serious dude, and he spoke out against the war. He gets arrested, and he stands trial and is convicted, and his conviction is also upheld. He will remain in prison until 1920. Interesting little side note is Eugene Debs will run for president from prison and still get almost 1 million votes, which is pretty interesting when you think about it. Now, another thing that we had to contend with was something called an influenza pandemic, the Spanish flu. This was a crop of H1N1 virus, influenza virus. It was a very, very deadly strain of H1N1 virus, and it spread throughout the world very, very rapidly. Something along the lines of about 20 million people died in the world worldwide as a result of this influenza. Many, many more people were affected, including my grandmother, when she was giving birth to my father, was suffering from this particular form of influenza. She did manage to survive. However, what does this have to do with the war? I mean, influenza outbreaks happen. Well, it turns out that this particular influenza outbreak probably started in Kentucky. And it started in a military base in Kentucky, and then those soldiers shipped from Kentucky to England, and they interacted with English soldiers who were then shipped to the front, where they interacted with French soldiers and Indian soldiers and soldiers from South African soldiers and soldiers from all over the world. And then those soldiers ended up going back and forth. And before you know it, because of the war, because of all of the men that were being shipped to and fro from colonies all over the world, this influenza virus becomes a pandemic. It becomes a global epidemic. It was really, so just in case the slaughter that was taking place during World War I itself wasn't bad enough, we also have this outbreak of the Spanish flu. But let's get ourselves into the fight here. Let's actually talk a little bit about the actual war, the actual combat experience. The U.S. forces that are going to be sent over to Europe are going to be known as the American Expeditionary Force. These are the U.S. soldiers who are going to be sent to Europe to fight. And they're going to go, and their general is a fellow by the name of General John Blackjack Pershing. Now, we see him, you probably read about him in your history textbooks. First time is he's the guy who was chasing down Pancho Villa during Woodrow Wilson's conflicts with Mexico. So it's a pretty famous guy, a pretty important fellow. And his job is going to be to put this American Expeditionary Force together. Now, the U.S. Army was not particularly big before World War I, and the U.S. was not prepared for a war of this particular magnitude. So when he comes into effect, he says, hey, we got to get these guys going. We got to get a whole bunch of men together, and we are going to have to train all of these men. So he gets these guys into England, into France, and he starts training them. And at first, of course, these American soldiers are going to be, hailed as heroes. You're here to save us. Thank you. This is great. French women throwing themselves. Yeah, at least that's the imagery, of course. And they were hailed as heroes. But after a while, the French would start, well, when are you guys actually going to do any fighting? Because we see you doing a lot of training, and we see you doing a lot of drinking and carousing. We don't actually see you doing an awful lot of fighting. So there's a lot of pressure on Pershing to get these soldiers into the fight, get them into the field, which ultimately he will do. So America's early participation in this war was mostly to get trained and also mostly to get material to the British and the French in the West at the Western Front. By this time, by the way, Russia has already signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. They have had a second revolution, the October-November Revolution, in which the Bolsheviks are going to take over. And the Bolsheviks take over and agree to take Russia out of the war, and they follow through. So now Germany has the upper hand. Germany now is able to send their soldiers from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, and now they are fighting only a one-front war, which is going to be a huge problem for the Allies. So the French are looking at the American soldiers and say, you've got to get into this fight. We're dying over here. We're getting killed. And ultimately, the U.S. will get involved. The first involvement of U.S. soldiers will be the Battle of Chateauthierry. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but you get the picture. So this is the first use of U.S. forces. That's going to be actually a military victory. A tremendous number of American soldiers are also going to fight with the French and English at the Second Battle of the Marne. Of course, the first Battle of the Marne is going to kind of halt German expansion into France, but the Second Battle of the Marne is actually going to repel the German army for the very first time in a significant way. The Germans are going to be pushed back. They're going to be forced to retreat from the Marne, and they're never ever going to regain their momentum. The Germans will continue to retreat after the Battle of the Marne. Of course, the largest of the battles during this time was the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, and this was a huge battle. Now, this was a battle, this is going to be the first major battle in which General Pershing is in charge of his own army, a purely American army. Before that, the Americans were fighting with the French under General Foch. But now this is the first time where Pershing himself is going to be involved in the battle. This is going to be a huge battle. It will last for 47 days. It will involve 1.2 million American soldiers. 10% of them will be killed or wounded as a result of this battle. It was an absolutely huge battle. It was the largest battle in American history up to that time. It was nothing that the United States has done before this. Even the Battle of Shiloh, the Battle of Gettysburg, nothing was as big as this particular military adventure, and it will ultimately be successful. And consequently, Germany will ask to surrender. Look, they've been fighting a two-front war for 4 years. Now they are facing an enemy that has fresh troops, fresh material, fresh weapons, fresh everything. And they have nothing. The British blockade has been effective of keeping Germany from getting supplies, getting food, getting anything. So these German soldiers were on their last legs. They weren't getting any supplies, anything to reinforce them, and they were done. They were exhausted after all of this warfare. Virtually an entire generation of young German men had been wiped out as a result of this war. They were done. And ultimately, the Americans and the Allies said, hey, look, we'll be happy to accept your surrender, but we're not going to accept the surrender of the Kaiser. The Kaiser, of course, was the Emperor of Germany. He's going to have to step down, and ultimately Kaiser Wilhelm will step down, and a new German republic will be formed that will effect a surrender. This is going to be a huge humiliation for the Germans, and a lot of Germans, especially upper-class Germans, Junkers, are going to say, hey, this is not a legitimate surrender because our legitimate government is not the one that actually did the surrendering. But ultimately, this chart gives you an idea of the costs of World War I, 8.5 million people were killed. Over 100,000 of those were Americans. This is on top of the 20 million people who died as a result of the influenza outbreak. 21 million people, 300,000 Americans were wounded. The cost in 1918 currency was $338 billion. In 2009 currency, we're looking at almost $5 trillion that this war cost. Civilian deaths were at 6.8 million. So 6.8, 8.5, holy cow, we're looking at 15 million people plus another 20 million, 35 million people dead as a result of this war. Wow. Nothing in human existence, nothing in human history has ever prepared anybody for anything quite like this. Now the trick was, of course, we won the war. Now we got to win the peace. And as is often the case, winning the peace is sometimes harder than winning the actual war. Now Wilson went in, remember Wilson's goals. Wilson went in with the goals of making the world safe for democracy and making sure that this was a war to end all wars. And shortly after going into this war, he came up with what he called 14 points. 14 points for guaranteeing that that the world will no longer have to face such a horrible, horrible war. And this 14 points is dividing it into three parts. The first part is dedicated to preventing any future war. I'm not going to read this to you. You've got it in your notes. The next is going to be, hey, let's figure out a fair way to adjust the borders. Let's not turn this into a war for land acquisition. If we turn this into a war for land acquisition, all we're going to do is tick people off, and they're going to come back and try to fight and try to regain the land that they lost. So let's figure out a rational, sane way of dividing up the land, dividing up the spoils, and everybody goes home relatively happy. But the signature part of Wilson's plan was this last part, a League of Nations, where all the nations in the world just come together, and when there's a conflict, we find civilized, democratic ways of resolving those conflicts. And this was going to take place in what he referred to as a League of Nations. It was a great, this great idea. And had these nations come together and actually implemented the 14 points, maybe things would have been different. There's no way to know, because they didn't do that. The folks involved in this were known as the Big Four. So some of these guys here, we have, of course, Woodrow Wilson here. This is Georges Clemenceau of France. And as I recall, I'm trying to remember here, this is Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and Lloyd George of David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom of England. These are the Big Four. You'll notice that none of these guys are German, and you will notice that none of them are Austrian, and you'll notice that none of them are Russian or Serbian or anything. Oh, well, sorry, some Serbians. But none of the, actually, now Russia lost millions of people in this war. They were left out because, of course, they had now become a communist nation. So we're not going to deal with them. And, of course, Germany lost. So we're not going to let them negotiate either. So the negotiation was a negotiation among the victors as to how we should handle the outcome of this war. So when Wilson comes over to them and says, hey, guys, why don't we just go back to our regular boundaries? Let's not try to acquire any land. Let's not try to make any money off of this. Let's just chalk it up to learning and call it a day. The other three kind of looked at him and went, no, I don't think so, my friend. We've just fought this horrible war for four going on 5 years. Millions of our people have been killed. Billions of dollars have been taken out of our economies. All of our societies are on shaky ground. We're trying to hold our colonies together. No, we got to get something out of this. We need to make Germany pay. We need to make Austria pay. We want our land. France, we want our Alsace-Lorraine. Italy, we want our, we want our Venice and those areas that are being held by the Austrians. We want that. And we're not going to, go back to our homes and say, hey, all of our young men and women and, there were 6 million civilians that died in this. All of those people, all of those 15 million people died for nothing. We're not going to do that. We want something out of this. And consequently, they were rather stubborn about it. And slowly but surely, the the three Europeans of the big four pretty much just X'd all of Wilson's 14 points except the League of Nations, right? They liked this idea of a League of Nations. They thought it was probably a good deal after they got the stuff that they wanted, right? They were willing to do that, and ultimately they will come up with the Treaty of Versailles, among other treaties. There were multiple treaties that were involved in this Versailles negotiation, but tantamount to this Treaty of Versailles was this idea of what was called the War Guilt Clause. And what this War Guilt Clause said was Germany is entirely responsible for this war, and therefore Germany has to pay. Germany must also completely demilitarize so that it can never be a threat to anybody ever again. And of course, Germany was not involved in this negotiation, so when the Germans were shown the Treaty of Versailles and told to sign, they didn't want to sign. So the Allies said, well, if you don't sign, we're going to invade your country and want to start this war again. And the Germans just couldn't do that. So begrudgingly, the Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles. It was absolutely a one-sided affair, and the Germans were expected to pay for everything. They were expected to pay that $5 trillion that was damaged, that was taken out of the European economy. Something that the German people were not unrealistically resentful of. The debate as to whether or not it really was Germany's fault is up for debate. But all right, well, Wilson didn't get his 14 points, but he did get his League of Nations, and that was the most important thing. I mean, it's a thing in and of itself. So he returns to the United States with what's left of his 14 points, the League of Nations. He presents the Treaty of Versailles to the Senate, well, the Senate said no. We don't want to get involved in a League of Nations, which of course the Treaty of Versailles did create a League of Nations. The Senate said we don't want to be involved in a League of Nations. We don't want to be involved in a situation that means that if a country attacks a country that's in the League, we're going to have to go to war with that country. And we don't want that decision to be made for us. We don't want to have to go to war over a treaty obligation. It is Congress's job to decide whether or not the United States goes into war, but if we sign this, then that takes the power of making that ultimate decision. It takes that power out of the hands of Congress. We're not going to sign it. Oh my God, Wilson is going to lose the only thing he was really able to get while he was negotiating in Versailles. So Woodrow Wilson really does appear to be very, very sincere about his war aims. He may very well have upheld to those ideals that we attributed to him. In fact, Woodrow Wilson at this point gets so angry with the Senate that he says, you know what, I'm going to take this fight to the people. Had he negotiated, he may have been able to get somewhere with the Senate, but instead he travels around the country. I'm not going to lose the one thing that I have left from my 14 points. Gets on a train, starts traveling around the country to put pressure on recalcitrant senators to make them sign onto this Treaty of Versailles. He's traveling around the country, giving speech after speech after speech, and apparently works so hard at trying to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified through the Senate that he actually becomes very ill. He suffers from a debilitating stroke and is no longer able to truly serve and continue on as President of the United States. Now, he will fulfill his term. Very few people during this time know just exactly how ill the President is. But ultimately, he can't go any further. He literally kills himself in a very real sense, fighting for this League of Nations, a fight that he will lose. The United States will never sign on to the League of Nations. So in essence, the United States does help the Allies win the war, but is incapable of winning the peace. And ultimately, as a result of this, possibly, but this is all probabilities, and may very well have been an influence in having to fight an even more devastating war later on. So anyway, that's where we're going to end it. See you next time.